Extraction. David hadn't expected to be back here this soon, or in this much pain. He screamed at the woman behind the counter, she of the ever-placid but harried face. He screamed and pointed to his mouth. He made certain she understood his intention before he squeezed his eyes shut again. The pain and the certainty that something had gone wrong, something had gone terribly wrong, attacked David in waves. An aide rushed in from the door beside him and ushered him into a room in the back. David Linsky hated going to the dentist, but here he was. His wisdom teeth had finally reached the point where they needed to be removed. He could barely eat because of the level of decay in them. Nothing to be ashamed of, his dentist had confided. Your wisdoms never came in completely, and even when they did, they're a bitch to reach with a toothbrush. What exactly are they going to do? Well, your top wisdom teeth came in just fine, so he'll probably just leave those in. But those bottom two are going to keep getting worse. They'll numb the jaw, which is sometimes difficult, bordering on impossible because of the bone structure there, and then go in, break the teeth, and take out the remaining shards. Probably have to stitch them up afterwards. You go a few days eating applesauce and milkshakes. They remove the stitches in a week or so, and you're home free. They break the teeth? David's tongue swirled gently over the indented surface of his rear left wisdom tooth, gently probing the crease. Yeah, teeth are pretty rough little suckers. Your lower teeth came in a little crooked, but not backwards or inverted or anything horrible like that. It shouldn't be a difficult procedure to remove them. So you don't think I need the general anesthetic? It's tough to say. Everyone's mouth and everyone's pain tolerance is different. But I think you'll be okay. The general anesthetic is more expensive, and sometimes insurance companies are picky about what they consider surgery. And if the local anesthetic doesn't do its job, Dr. Lindstrom can just make a later date to get it done with general. David thought for a long time, his lips twitching and his eyes darting between the dentist and an invisible focal point on the other side of the room. Finally, he said, "Well, I'd say I guess it couldn't hurt, but that doesn't seem to apply." His dentist smiled and smacked David on the shoulder. "That's the spirit, and be sure to let me know if Dr. Lindstrom is really a sadist in disguise, so I know not to send any future patients to him, all right?" The dentist smiled, and David returned it, uneasily. So that's why, 5 days later, David Linsky went to Dr. Lindstrom's office for the first time. His pain was not intense, but annoying to the degree that he could only eat on one side of his mouth. What bothered him wasn't so much that the teeth hurt, but simply the frustration over the fact that a part of his body, which he'd taken for granted for so long, was rebelling against his wishes. It seemed counterproductive toward self-preservation for the teeth to revolt. They told his brain, it hurts to eat. Therefore, David ate less. Of course, this did not cause the teeth to heal. It only caused his stomach to growl more often. David introduced himself to the receptionist. She gave a pained smile and handed him a clipboard. Pages to fill out, as usual. Why was it that no matter what doctor you went to, no matter how specialized, you got the same introductory papers to fill out? Probably some sort of law. David dutifully filled them out, as he had dozens of times before at dozens of hospitals and specialists over the years. David was not prone to ill health, but he had moved quite often during his life, and he believed in going to a specialist for everything, rather than a general practitioner. If his foot hurt, he went to a podiatrist. To David, it was simple logic. David waited, and 40 minutes after his appointment was supposed to begin, he was taken to the room. The room was, of course, the infamous site with the chair specific only to dentists, oral surgeons, and the like. David sat in said chair, leaned forward as the aide put the metal chain around his neck, and noted with no small amount of anxiety that the tools on the fold-out tray before him looked quite different than his dentist's usual array. David waited, tense. Usually, at his dentist's, the aide spoke to him, tried to calm him. None of that here. Just a curt, "Dr. Lindstrom will be in shortly," followed by the sound of the door closing behind him. David breathed deeply and regularly, trying to stop the panic attack that threatened to overwhelm him. The door opened. A gruff, "Hey, pal," came from behind him. David turned to see the man. Dr. Lindstrom was an older fellow, gray crew-cut hair and sunken eyes, but the build of a 40-year-old. A 40-year-old Marine. He patted David's shoulder, looked over the chart, then back into David's face. "Gonna get those bottom two out today, are we?" David nervously answered in the affirmative. "Don't worry, pal. I'll be in and out before you know it. First, let's get you numbed up." Dr. Lindstrom brought out 2 shockingly large needles and prepped them. David received the Novocaine, wincing a little, but doing his best to hold still. Stick, burn, came the litany of desensitization. David breathed deeply and stared at the ceiling. "There we go, all done." Lindstrom pulled away. "I'll be back in a little bit to get those fellows out." Lindstrom quickly flung his gloves away and exited the room. David was left alone again, the numbness slowly creeping through his jaw. He waited, tapping his heels against the chair in a staccato rhythm. He grew bored with this, and contented himself with trying to whistle through his lips' steadily increasing immobility. He should have brought a book. He knew there would be waiting in the waiting room and in here, but he never seemed to think of bringing along a book to occasions such as this. Damn. Finally, Dr. Lindstrom came back into the room, followed by what sounded like 2 other people. David didn't bother checking. He concentrated on calming down and stared straight ahead. Lindstrom snapped on a new pair of gloves, came over to David. He reclined the chair. "You getting pretty numb there, pal?" Lindstrom pushed some sort of plastic obstruction into David's mouth, keeping his teeth wide apart. Lindstrom grabbed an instrument, forced it into David's mouth, and David felt the strangest sensation as something grabbed his wisdom tooth. The pain that he had felt when a piece of food would hit the decaying tooth cracked through him as his tooth broke. It sounded to David like a bone breaking. He gave only a slight cry, but his body arched violently, his arms grabbing the seat. "Whoa, pal. Not quite numb there?" David choked out, his eyes wet from the pain. "Here." Lindstrom threw whatever instrument he had been using down on the tray. David heard metal rattling. "Where's Cindy?" "Yes?" Anesthetic. I need some more anesthetic. First drawer, right? Yes, Lindstrom snapped. He manhandled the plastic block in David's mouth, switching sides. Let's try the other side, pal, Lindstrom said. His voice was quick and rushed, an infantryman digging through the dirt for his lost last shell. Lindstrom glanced over to the side of the room. Cindy, second drawer. Second. But you said... The anesthetic has always been in the second drawer, goddammit. Now hurry it up. Let's try this one, Lindstrom said to David in a hushed, breathy voice, an old man sharing a dirty joke with his grandson. The instrument came back into David's mouth on the other side, and again the searing pain shot through his head. David's eyes clamped shut, and the red he saw made him fear he might pass out. Not quite numb either, huh, pal? Lindstrom threw the instrument down and grabbed something from Cindy. David saw, dimly, needles coming at his mouth again. He felt no pain when the needles jabbed into his gums, only pressure. They pierced him again and again. Finally, Lindstrom stood back and said, Well, that should do it. We'll give it a little bit more time. Here, Joanne, we've got some bleeding here. Stop that, would you? He snapped his gloves off and left. When Lindstrom came back later, the operation went quickly and smoothly. It still hurt, but David just wanted to get it over with. He couldn't tell how much damage had already been done to his teeth, but he knew there was bleeding, and that was enough to convince him to get the damn thing out of the way. David found that if he closed his eyes and focused on good memories from his life, everything seemed quite distant and unreal. He didn't open them until it was finished. Afterwards, he felt dizzy and looked pale. Cold sweat stuck to his face. He was taken into an antechamber with a bed, where he stretched out briefly. Then he got up, made an appointment for a week later to get the stitches out on his left side, and went home. David could not believe the amount of blood that came out of his mouth. They told him to expect that, but then gave him only a foot-long roll of gauze to last until the bleeding stopped. David took the Tylenol 3 and penicillin at the prescribed times. He changed the gauze once an hour, dropping the gooey, bloody mass into the trash can. He felt sick every time he looked at it, and in his mind flashed subliminal images. Lindstrom leaning in, the red flash accompanied by the crack of enamel. Lindstrom strained, "God damn it." David had to go to the supermarket that night and get more gauze. He didn't go to work the next day. Not a problem. He ran his own small jewelry store in town and could make his own hours. He called Julie, his assistant, and let her know he wouldn't be in till later, if at all. Then he went back to bed and slept through most of the day. David couldn't stop thinking about it. Was it his fault? If only he had taken better care of his teeth. If only he had gotten it taken care of sooner. He should have requested the general anesthetic. But he didn't want to waste Lindstrom's time. He didn't possess the power to say no to Dr. Lindstrom. And what other choice did he have? Let his teeth rot and cause him more pain? Besides, once Lindstrom cracked the tooth the first time, there was no turning back. The deed had been done. David's will was broken. His tender gums, which he refused to let his tongue even think of getting near, felt abused, bleeding orifices soiled by the unwanted touch of another. All he had wished was for it all to go away. But even now, his mind couldn't accept that it was over. Every time David closed his eyes, the images, the sounds, the smell of mined enamel came back. He thought he might go crazy if it kept up this way. He couldn't stop thinking about the time he broke his foot in college. He was a sophomore. He had to have surgery, and for days afterwards he couldn't stop thinking about how he was permanently damaged. He'd never be able to play football again. No great loss to the professional world there, but still, even playing tag football with possible future kids was out of the question. And if he fell on the fracture again, it might mean amputation. David's then girlfriend, Valerie, had stayed with him at the hospital, went with him everywhere to make sure he didn't trip while getting used to the crutches. He never had to ask for her help. It was simply understood. He was a loved one in pain, and she was there to help. God, he wished he had someone like that right now. He needed it. He needed the solace of another human being, the ability to curl up with them, cry away the anger, frustration, and hurt, and then sleep the sleep of one whose love is requited. He couldn't even remember now why he and Valerie had broken up. A fight, he assumed. They had fought a lot near the end. One of the fights must have stuck. He had no one with whom he could curl up, and he felt like it would be inappropriate to call his parents, to whom he rarely spoke, to bitch about a routine operation. He was alone with the stabs of memory. The doctor's convex angled face too close, the plastic block in his mouth forcing him open, the stinging intrusion of the needles. David shivered and tried to sleep. By Monday, 4 days after the operation, his mouth was feeling semi-normal again, and he could open his jaws wide enough to allow solid food in. He didn't dare eat anything too hard, but bread was no problem, and he was able to drink again without spilling. He asked Julie if she'd like to do Italian for lunch. They often lunched together, although Julie was happily married. No romantic overtones impinged, but the company was nice. And she agreed. David couldn't stand the thought of being alone for very long, especially after the long, isolated weekend he had spent. It was during the meal that the venerated normalcy that had returned to his daily routine was ripped asunder once again. Julie was telling him about the shipment of pewter figurines they had gotten in on Friday. David was usually there to oversee incoming items, but Friday was the day he had taken off, and David was almost finished with his spaghetti. He was trying to focus on her words, but his attention was mainly absorbed by a small piece of spaghetti strand that was stuck toward the back of his mouth. He gently probed with his tongue, trying to free it, unwilling to move his tongue too quickly for fear of harming the stitches or, shudder, touching the wounded flesh. So only that one was cracked, but it's the main piece, you know? And it wasn't a small crack. I mean, the damn thing's lips were broken right off. So I called him, and they were really nice, but they seemed kinda obstinate, you know? So I just told him to expect a call from you on Monday. The spaghetti had tasted good, but David still couldn't get the faint taste of blood out of his mouth. Probably just psychosomatic. Damn it, almost had the strand there, just a little to the left. David cried out, his eyes opening wide, his hands smacking against the table, searching for purchase, flailing. He felt like slamming his head into the hard wood, trying to dislodge the pain, but he feared that would bring on the bleeding again. Fuck. His fucking mouth. What was going on in there? He must have dislodged a stitch. That's what happened. Probing with his tongue, he had pulled a stitch out, and now, shit, he could taste a small chunk of meat in his mouth, hanging loosely by a flap of skin from the empty socket where his left rear wisdom tooth had been. Jesus fuck, Julie gasped, immediately looking around the restaurant. David pointed to his mouth and managed to gasp, "Two," and she understood. Can I do anything?" she asked, the repugnance obvious on her face. Take two, doctor," David managed, unable to unclench his teeth for fear of more meat becoming dislodged. Yeah, sure," Julie said, standing and putting her arm around him. And so, after half-intelligible instructions, a lot of hand signals and false turns, here David was again, in the pristine office, stumbling up to the receptionist's counter like a Karloff monster. He gave a half-whine, half-shout, and pointed to his mouth. The receptionist grimaced but said, "I'll get the doctor right away." She stood and swiftly moved to the rear of the building. David wanted to leap through the window and shake her like a rag doll for not running. Couldn't she see he was in pain here? David felt his muscles tensing and relaxing, gripping the counter tightly. His eyes squeezed shut. He didn't even think about the others in the waiting room, except as dimly perceived shadow people. That fucking piece of spaghetti was still there. David's tongue was pushed tight against the inside of his teeth, and as his muscles flexed, he could feel the pasta wriggle with the movement of his tongue. Shit, was it mired in the gum hole? Was that possible? David tried to concentrate enough to swallow, but the belligerent little strand stayed there. He couldn't bring himself to touch it directly with the tip of his tongue. He was afraid if he pushed it away, more flesh would erode. A long, tortured sound came from David's throat, and when he relaxed his muscles and opened his eyes, all he could see were the blue and yellow spots obscuring his line of sight. Again and again, stabs of pain shot up from his wound. The surgery all over again, the distinct, singular feeling of something being forced out of his flesh. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the door opened and a woman, Joanne, quickly took him into a different version of the room. David dropped into the chair and grabbed the armrests, his breath coming in short, shallow gulps. Only a few seconds after a bib had been placed around his neck, Dr. Lindstrom came in. "Having some troubles, are we, pal?" he asked, not looking in David's direction, throwing away the gloves he had been wearing and quickly snapping on a new pair. "Let's take a look, see what we've got, all right?" Dr. Lindstrom pulled the tray close, grabbed a plastic block. "Now I need you to relax long enough to let me get this in there, okay, pal?" David nodded, relaxed, breathed. His fingers tensed, his nails digging shallow furrows into his palms. Lindstrom quickly jammed the block into place, brought the overhead light closer. He peered into David's mouth, searching, and then a knowing expression came into his eyes. "Ah, I see what happened there. No problem. We'll get that fixed for you in a jiffy." Lindstrom went over to the cabinet, grabbed a needle, and came back. He jabbed the anesthetic home, wasting no time with care, simply getting the job done. "Usually we'd wait for this to take full effect, but I can tell you're in pretty bad shape right now. Let's go ahead and get this taken care of. Won't take but a minute." Lindstrom used a second needle, then grabbed a metal instrument that reminded David somewhat of tongs. "See, that's already starting to numb it a little, isn't it?" David nodded. He could feel the Novocaine doing its job. Lindstrom reached in with the instrument, and David felt a sickening pull in his gums. It felt like a tooth was being extracted from the same spot as before, only this time the tooth came quickly, and he could feel it slide along the flesh, slipping out like a birthday candle pulled from a cupcake. The strand of spaghetti was gone. Except David saw Lindstrom holding the instrument in the air, the spaghetti strand in its claws. It didn't look like spaghetti. It looked like... When David was 15, he had worked at a dog kennel for 2 weeks. He couldn't get regular work because he wasn't of legal age yet, but he was able to get odd farm-type jobs for a decent wage. 2 weeks was all he could take of the job, though, because one of the main chores was a weekly shit scooping. Once equipped with a surgical mask, the smell wasn't the worst part. The worst was digging the rake into the mounds of dog shit and overturning vast, seething colonies of maggots. They were disgusting creatures, white and wiggling, blind little shit parasites. For hours after finishing work, David would constantly swipe his hand over various parts of his body, certain that his flesh was infested with maggots. He feared they would somehow sense the feces inside him, crawl up his leg and into his asshole, and begin eating his bowels from the inside out. The creature held in the prongs reminded David of the maggots, only this one was slightly different. It was not sickly white, rather, it was red from David's blood. Also, David could see its mouth. It opened and closed, the tiny teeth visible. And David realized it was making a noise, a keening wail, tinny but distinct, the sound of a child taken from its mother's teat. "Little fella didn't want to stay down in there. Must have taken a wrong turn, huh? Well, he's all better now." Lindstrom smiled, and David felt the color drain from his face. The world turned gray. The sounds faded until it was like watching a black and white television in the middle of an empty swimming pool. Everything rushed away from David, and he realized it was because his eyes were closing. He passed out. David woke and looked around, groggily. He was in the room, on the chair. His lower jaw was still numb, and his head hurt. He swiveled his legs, tried to get up, fell back down. He took a deep breath, tried again, succeeded. He held onto the chair for support. The door opened quietly. A woman's head peeked in. "You up and at 'em?" she asked, a polite, rehearsed smile on her face. What happened?" David asked. His voice sounded like a cheese grater on concrete. "One of your stitches was bothering you. It got sewed into a really sensitive area. We're sorry about that. We went ahead and took them out. Everything was pretty well healed anyway. No charge, of course. Images sliced through David's head. Lindstrom yelling, "God damn it!" The white, wiggling creature. Was it real? It didn't seem like it could be yet. Why the hell would David imagine such a thing? "Oh," David answered. "Thanks. How long have I been out?" He was feeling a little steadier now. "Just 20 minutes or so. Your girlfriend's still waiting for you in the waiting room, I think." "Not my girlfriend. But thanks." David slowly walked to the door. He made it just fine. The nurse kept up her serene, ingratiating smile. David didn't see Lindstrom anywhere. In the waiting room, Julie stood up. "David, Jesus, is everything okay?" "Yeah, I think so," he answered. "Mr. Linsky?" the receptionist asked. "Yes." "You don't need another appointment, but be sure to give us a call or stop by if anything else is bothering you." "Thank you." He turned back to Julie. He started to speak but couldn't think of what to say. "They put a maggot in me," he thought, but it didn't seem real. A maggot was eating my gums. It must have been an hallucination. What purpose would Dr. Lindstrom have had for putting a maggot? Wasn't a maggot into David's mouth? What possible end result, God damn it, could be reached? David had heard of experimental research dealing with maggots and extreme cases of necrosis, but a routine wisdom tooth extraction hardly seemed to qualify. But it seemed so real. David's tongue gently probed at the area. Still no sensation, but the flesh felt smooth. "Let's get out of here," David said quietly, and walked out the door with Julie. As he entered the hallway, his hand involuntarily brushed against his arm twice, quickly, and then fluttered back to rest at his side.